Yes, sir.
But on my memory would be that in considerable part it was Mr. Dulles and his policies that made him believe that a central pact would help in the stabilization of the Middle East and Southeast Asia areas. Now, another comment on Secretary Dulles, which isn't necessarily applicable to this particular circumstance, but often I say the press or the media, but I don't mean to restrict it to them because I think it's in academia or just the general public look at Mr. Dulles as a very not narrow-minded, but very set in his ways and definite views. I found him quite the opposite. As I say, I often traveled with him. At that time, he traveled in a 4-engine airplane, propeller-driven, so it had about 10 berths in it. So he would limit the party to 10 people. Included 2 security guards. I mention that because today they take innumerable civil secret service. Then there were only 2 State Department guards. No secret service. Occasionally Mrs. Dulles would go with him, his secretary. Perhaps the counselors of the State Department, sometimes the legal advisor, sometimes the assistant secretary, and the desk officer of the areas concerned, and then one representative from defense, which in those days happened to be me, the I. He would, if he were writing a speech, he would make a draft of it. He would pass it around to all of the people with him, saying, "Give me any thoughts you have, changes or additions." And I was impressed that he would listen. And say the desk officer would say, "Well, Mr. Dulles, I don't think you should say that because of these reasons. Or I think you ought to add this in because of these reasons." Mr. Dulles would listen and say, "Well," and he might argue the point. Be an exchange, and he said, "All right, I'll put it in." Or he said, "No, I disagree with you. I'll leave it out." It was he had an open mind. Now that didn't mean when he made up his mind finally after considering all the points he thought. But he didn't stick to it. He did, unless he saw some reason to change. But he did not have the narrowness of view or the unchangeability that is often people still reflect about it, at least in my limited experience with it.
Well, he generally treated as being sort of an inflexible person. That's the popular.
I thought he had a flexible mind, willing to explore all aspects of the problem. Then when he made up his mind, he did remain inflexible in the sense that he didn't see any point to change that unless somebody gave him a really good reason, and then I think he would have considered that, and if it modified his view, he would have changed it. I came away with a feeling he was a very fine Secretary of State. And he did keep Eisenhower fully informed, and Eisenhower would be in touch with him. So people would say, "Well, the President doesn't really know what's going on." And he did. And even if he hadn't taken an interest, which he did, the Secretary would have always gone back to him.
In terms of Dulles' interest in the Baghdad Pact, I guess the U.S. never became a formal member of the Pact.
Yes, I guess.
It was just the British and the countries in the region. But apparently the U.S. still participated in the military planning in the past. Did the ISA have to coordinate that military planning, or have to do with the military planning, or would it be someone else in the Pentagon that would actually do the war planning and so forth?
Well, any actual planning would have been done by that area that was the one involved. If we were really talking about military planning, it wouldn't have been ISA. It would have been Joint Chiefs, a particular service and their aspect of it. But ISA would have been in touch with what was going on and would have participated in any way that was valid for it to participate. And obviously wouldn't try to say what strategic or tactical military plans should be. It might have a comment on it, but that wasn't an area of expertise of ISA or our state for that matter. You might have ideas on it. It was too important to be left to the generals. So as for the specifics, I think you go to the military.
I see. Did you stay at the State Department? Were you at the Defense Department until the end of the administration, till the end of Eisenhower? Did you participate in transition talks with the Kennedy administration officials?
Yes, to a degree. I talked with both Mr. McNamara and Mr. Nitze. Mr. Nitze being my immediate successor, and some of his people. And I've always had a higher regard and respect for Mr. Nitze, which has only grown over the years. And I'm happy he's in the position he is in today, and he's an able, dedicated fine American.
Did you have any more? Did you do any further government work during the 60s? You went back to your law practice, apparently. Right, but
I came back to New York. I loved working in Washington, and I always have, but once my job was over, I was quite happy to come back to New York. I never had a desire to hang on in Washington. But I did negotiate with Panama about a canal treaty under Johnson, which ultimately came to fruition at a much later date. And then in the late, in 1969, early, I negotiated in Peru under President Nixon. Peru had nationalized the International Petroleum Company, which was a Canadian company with a subsidiary of Exxon. So I was asked to go down. I was practicing law in New York at that time. I was asked to go down and negotiate with a new Peruvian military government that had just seized power for the rest of my 60s.
Did William Rogers ask you to do that?
No, well, indirectly, I suppose. The person who talked to me was Elliot Richardson.
He was at the State Department then, right?
He was Undersecretary of State at the time. Undersecretary, later title was changed to Deputy Secretary. That was actually when I was there. I was an Undersecretary one day and Deputy Secretary the next. I was the only one who spoke against changing the title. It seemed to be the fashion in Washington those days. There was a Deputy Secretary of Defense, and then everybody else thought, well, we ought to have a Deputy Secretary instead of an Undersecretary. But for many years, the state had the Undersecretary, who was the number two. It also had an Undersecretary for Political Affairs, or an Undersecretary for Economic Affairs. It was the Undersecretary, who later became the Deputy Secretary. Pure matter of title, no real significance at all.
In terms of the Peruvian question that you helped negotiate, without going into the details, did the government, the U.S. government, consider invoking the Hickory Amendment at any point during the negotiations that were the nationalization of these properties?
There was consideration of it, but I think I don't know how serious it ever really was. I recommended against it, although it certainly was one of the uses. It was a negotiating tool, not in the sense that you used it as a threat, but they knew that was in the background.
They called it foreign aid. Did the oil companies involved see it that way? Did they?
I never talked to the oil company in any major way. I talked to one of their representatives, but they really didn't have much day-to-day or any real participation. And in fact, all I did really was keep the subject open. The new military government, in my memory, may not be accurate. They came in power one day, and the immediate reaction in the country was unfavorable. And it was almost the very next day, maybe 2 days at most, that they confiscated IPC. And that was a popular move. And really made them popular and gave them a base to work on popularity which they hadn't had in the first 24 hours. This is at least as I remember it. And when I went down to negotiate shortly thereafter, it was clear that the government was not going to take any remedial action with respect to IPC. We had talks going on for 6 months or so, or even longer, but quite concentrated for the first few months. But what it did do was keep it open to such a time where later on it was settled to each the United States and the Peruvian government reaching a settlement, but each interpreting it in different ways. The United States, in effect, interpreted it as remuneration and settlement of the IPC case. The Peruvian government said it had nothing to do with IPC. This was another matter that they were settling with the United States. So they gave each an out. The U.S. didn't need an out. It was really just handling it in such a way that it didn't cause the government of Peru to feel they were backing down on what had been one of their first acts.
And you mentioned the IPC, that's International Petroleum Corporation, is that correct?
That was the name of it.
I'm not sure. Yeah. Now, what were the circumstances that led to your appointment as Undersecretary of State? Was it deputy negotiations or?
That I don't know. I was telephoned one day by Mr. Rogers and said, "Will I come down and see him?" And this was in 1970, mid-1970. So, but one never really knows what leads to these things. In fact, I've noticed in government there'll often be a group of people on a list, not on a list per se. I don't mean that nobody has a list of potential candidates, but someone is looking for an assistant secretary of state or defense or treasury or whatever department. There'll be certain names that will come up on when they're being discussed. If there's an undersecretary designed by a department 2 weeks later or 2 months later, some of the same names will come up to be discussed. So a lot of it's luck. You might be considered for an assistant secretary one day, or undersecretary another day, or commissioner another day. All depends, I think, on what background they're seeking, and you can be considered for different posts.
That's interesting. How would you characterize your responsibilities as Undersecretary and then Deputy Secretary of State?
Well, in essence, you run the day-by-day State Department and handle anything that comes up that the Secretary isn't handling, or doesn't want to handle, or wants you to handle, both substantive and administrative.
Did you have a deputy that worked closely with you, or your own special assistant?
Well, I had a special assistant, very able fellow named Nick Veliotti, who later went on and retired from the service as a distinguished ambassador in Italy. Had been also Assistant Secretary of State for Middle Eastern Affairs. He was ambassador to Egypt as his last post. He was deputy chief of mission in Israel. He was ambassador in Jordan, so he saw the Israeli-Arab problem on both sides. Well, distinguished Foreign Service officer, and I was very fortunate to have him in his younger days. I think he was a very able, energetic, intelligent young man. But then you also, of course, had Undersecretary for Political Affairs, which was Undersecretary Johnson. You had when I was there, Nat Samuels was Deputy Undersecretary for Economic Affairs. You had all your Assistant Secretaries. You had Ed Elliott, of whom you spoke earlier, was the secretary of he headed the Secretariat of the Department at that time. And counselor, so there are a lot of people on which you can rely, and on whom you can rely, and with whom you work.
How closely did you work with Secretary Rogers?
Well, quite closely. We met almost daily.
You did a meeting of all the undersecretaries, basically.
No, he would start out often each day with usually Mr. Elliott, who knew what everything was going on procedurally. Perhaps the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, the then Undersecretary, Deputy Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, myself. That type of combination. 2 to 4 or 5 people at most. And once a week or so, he might have all of the assistant secretaries, maybe every other week. But I think that became less of a... And you get so many people, you have so many diverse interests, that it tends to be a little amorphous.
Could you get a sense of how did the foreign policy making process under the Nixon administration compare to what that used by Eisenhower? How can you
180 degrees different. President Eisenhower really used the staff system in the NSC. The NSC was made to coordinate and discuss policy and not decide policy. And it had some very good national security assistants. Bobby Cutler ran it for a while, and then Gordon Gray ran it for a while. Both were able men. And Gordon Gray had been the Assistant Secretary of the Army at one point. But I never would have thought of either one of them trying to compete for the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense. Not that they hesitated to speak up what they thought, but they would coordinate and present a coordination view rather than trying to make it their own specific opinion. Under President Nixon, there was some of that, but the real top policy was President Nixon's policy, but added to and carried out.
I just want to remind you.
Holy smoke! Added to and carried out by Dr. Kissinger. So really much of the policy was Dr. Kissinger working under and with President Nixon. Now, to some degree, obviously, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and others would participate. But in essence, it was really the President's policy effectively carried out by Dr. Kissinger.